All right, welcome to another watercolor demonstration. This time I've chosen a little photograph I did in the Boise Foothills. You can see it there. It's pretty simple, not a lot of detail in this particular painting. I was more interested in the color combinations, blue and warm colors, especially the sunlight hitting the foothills in the background. So I did a value study that I do on a lot of my paintings, trying to establish the light, middle, and darker values of the painting just in the larger shapes that you've indicated. I usually do these value studies using just graphite that you can buy and put on with water and a brush, which is very similar to watercolor in the way that goes on the paper. The drawing that I'm doing now is just establishing these basic shapes from the value study. I pay more attention to that really than the photograph I have, particularly since it's a landscape with not a lot of detail in it. The watercolor paper I'm drawing on is a Stonehenge cold press 140, which comes in a block, and it's a good size to do these smaller studies, which sometimes then I'll use for a larger painting. The colors here usually do some combination of cool and warm colors. I'm mixing several blues, cerulean blue, these are Daniel Smith colors, cobalt blue, and ultramarine blue, which I'll use for some of the darker values. The warmer colors include, this is a French ochre, which is a new color to me. I haven't used that very much. Sort of like a sienna color or ochre color, and that was quinacridone gold and Payne's blue gray, which I have not used very much. It's sort of like a neutral tint for a darker color. And there's burnt sienna, which I use for a lot of the warmer colors. And I've mixed up some of these colors in just a very watery consistency that I'll generally use for my first washes, and I put them in these little containers here so that I'll have access to it and won't have to be mixing a lot as the first wash goes on. I'm going to try to keep that fairly wet during all of the first wash. So I'm wetting the paper just a little bit to get started, and as you can see, applying a cool mixture, primarily using some of that Payne's blue gray and just grays that were left over in my palette, and trying to mix in some of the cooler hues with the blue, especially in that center area where I wanted to highlight the sun hitting the distant hills. Carrying that wash down, keeping it pretty wet so it'll all flow together. That painting surface is on a slight tilt, probably about 20 degrees. You can see now the first wash dried, so it's quite a bit lighter than it looked when it was going on. And I'm starting to apply some of the middle values at this point. Switched over to this larger chiseled brush that I like because you can create some hard edges, and then once you've done that, I can use it to soften those to get some mixture of hard and soft edges, which I think adds a lot of interest to almost any painting. Coming back now with the bluer grays, I think that is the Payne's blue gray that I put in there in the middle, probably mixed with a little bit of the blue mixture I had. And the consistency here is a little heavier than the first wash to establish these middle values. That large brush you can see I used again to create some hard edges, trying to make a little bit of interest with shapes that are consistent with the value study that I did on the left. And again, going back in with a wet brush and softening some of the edges so they're not all hard. And I've got a mixture there of the two. I'm starting now to add warmer, darker values to try to, again, be consistent with the value study that I have. I think you'll see in this painting I get a little bit carried away with some of the darker values, which is a mistake that I frequently made. I think I just try to get a lot of contrast and create some drama in the painting, and sometimes go a little bit overboard with the darker colors a little bit too early. That blue in the upper right there, I knew right away when I put that on that I was probably going to have to go back over that, but that area in the value study is going to be pretty dark anyway, so I wasn't too worried about it. So again, I'm just following through the same pattern that I established earlier, trying to develop areas of interest. If I see some shapes I don't like, I'll try to change them a little bit. Putting a little variety in the background hills. Just basically working it to the point where I think I'm coming up with a composition that I like. The value study itself is not great, I don't think, but it still was something that I thought I could use to develop a decent painting. I think at this point in the painting, I know it's lacking something, so in my mind I'm thinking I'm just going to add some more dark and try to create enough contrast so that I'll bring the composition to life a little bit. But as you can see as I go on, I think I'm going too far. There's a point here where I probably should have just stopped and evaluated, maybe let it dry, and then make some changes. But because I'm trying to do this demo all at once, I'm just going ahead. And some of the results are not all that great. I'm trying to loosen it up and make it more consistent so that the dark areas shouldn't have a lot of breakage in them. They should be, for the most part, connected. And so I think I'm, at this point, just trying to get back to that point where the shapes go together a little bit better. The brush I'm using again is softening some of the edges here and there. And looking at it, the little vertical fence posts are not working at all, and I'm going to have to go over that and kind of eliminate that. But in the process of doing that, the painting just keeps getting darker and darker. The consistency of the paint that's on there now is very thick, and you can see I'm just making tree shapes by drawing the brush right up through the wet paint that's in there, which is working pretty well. It's making some nice calligraphy type of marks, which again adds some interest to this little painting. I think it needed a little bit more color, so I'm putting some red in there and blending it out a little bit so it's not too thick just in one area. Struggling to find something that I think is consistent with what I had in mind in the beginning, and trying to get to the point where it looks a little bit more painterly than, to me at this point, it's just not, there's not much uniformity in it. Now this phase here, I decided to put some of the orange color in, and I think that's helping the painting. It's unifying it a little bit more, brings the same color in as is in the background hill, which helps. And then keeping some of those light areas in the foreground light, I think, helping too. Now some of that value contrast is lost once it dries, And now I'm trying to rehabilitate it by taking some of those darker areas out just with a wet brush, lifting them, and trying to make a little bit more interest with lighter areas in addition to some of the darker ones. And this is something that you do when you've just gone too far and it's not working, and so you're trying to salvage the painting a little bit. But it's working to a degree. I think I'm getting a little bit more interest because of the varied light and dark edges. So there's still hope. Well, I added some red in there. I didn't have that recorded earlier, but again, trying to give it a little bit more interest. It looks kind of flat. And going back and adding some of the contrast that I've lost with a cooler color to contrast against the warm colors that I put in there. Again, that doesn't appear that it's working very well at this point. It looks like the dark shapes are not very well connected, so I'm fighting this painting and trying to get to a point where I think it has a little bit more unity, softening some of the edges. There's too much of a hard line across the middle, so I'm adding some darker values into the foreground, so I don't have a hard line right across the middle of the painting. And it's starting to help a little bit. See now right here, there's a little bit better, more interesting shape, I think, to the painting than what I had by leaving those light passage areas in there. And now I'm just making some calligraphy marks with a little bit darker paint, and I think that's helping. I think it's giving a little more depth to the painting, the contrasting the light value behind the trees with some of the calligraphy marks for the tree itself. And I think that improved it a bit. I'm using my my palette knife, just to put in some marks and add a few more branches to it. While the painting's wet, I can make some lighter marks, which you can see, and I'm doing that now to connect that fence line together, just with looks like a little bit more like a fence. And so adding a few more red spots and nearing completion. I hope you've enjoyed this. I think it's a study on how to salvage a painting more than anything else. And there's the final painting as it's dried out. Thank you.